Buenas noches, estamos muy contentos de darles nuevamente la bienvenida a la tercera conferencia magistral del ciclo La Humanidad Quebrada, organizado por el Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, conmemorando los 80 años del inicio de las masacres de los Einsatzgruppen a las comunidades judías de la Unión Soviética. En definitiva, el inicio del exterminio de los judíos europeos. El encuentro de hoy se titula La destrucción alemana de los judíos en la Bielorrusia soviética. Asesinato en masa, perseguidores y supervivencia. Y nos honrará con su disertación el doctor Christian Gerlach. Y el panel será moderado por la investigadora asociada al museo y organizadora del ciclo, Magíster Marcia Ras. Poder conocer con mayor foco las implicancias del proceso de exterminio permite realizar preguntas acerca de las decisiones locales e individuales de los actores en los diversos contextos. Bielorrusia es uno de los escenarios menos conocidos de lo que fueron los territorios soviéticos de entonces, y sin embargo poseía una importante judería antes de la guerra, como lo fue en la mayor parte de los territorios de Europa Oriental. Allí también funcionó Malitrostinets, uno de los campos de exterminio recientemente identificado y reconocido como tal por la historiografía. Iluminar los aspectos menos conocidos del Holocausto Shoah permiten dar cuenta tanto de la magnitud del crimen como de las complejidades que implicó en cada uno de los escenarios donde se llevó adelante. ¿Qué sucedió con los judíos de Bielorrusia? ¿Cómo actuaron los nazis, sus colaboradores y los vecinos locales? ¿Qué similitudes y diferencias hay entre aquel escenario y otros tal vez más conocidos? La pregunta sigue siendo el camino para revisar no solamente tener una mejor idea de lo que fue la Shoah en sí, sino también para saber qué nos dicen las lecturas más actuales en un mundo tan dinámico como el actual. Y sobre todo, qué podemos aprender para el futuro de estos análisis más pormenorizados. Muchas gracias, doctor Gerlach, por la generosidad de haber aceptado nuestra invitación y brindarnos hoy esta conferencia. En nombre de la dirección del museo que compartimos junto a Fabiana Mindlin, agradecemos nuevamente al equipo que diseñó y lleva adelante este ciclo, Bruno Garbari, Marcia Ras, Eliana Ambra, Jonathan Epstein, Brenda Fischer, Gabriel Merlo y a todo el staff profesional de nuestra institución. Vaya nuestra especial gratitud también para la intérprete de este ciclo, Dana Iofe. También agradecemos el acompañamiento del Auschwitz Institute y su directora para América Latina, Eugenia Carbone, a quien le paso la palabra hoy para brindarnos su mensaje. Muchas gracias, doctora Eugenia Carbone, por acompañarnos.
Gracias, Jonathan. Gracias a todos en realidad por acompañarnos y también por invitarnos a sumarnos a este evento, a este ciclo de conferencias, a esta conferencia en particular. Yo no quiero sacar mucho tiempo porque sé que tenemos un montón de cosas y me sumo a las líneas y preguntas que vos recién, Jonathan, presentabas como que nos iban a estar guiando en la conferencia de Christian Gerlach, a quien también agradezco un montón esta participación. Solamente dejar en claro que el Instituto Auschwitz para la Prevención de Genocidio y Atrocidades Masivas en general, pero muy particularmente desde la oficina o el programa para América Latina que dirijo desde Buenos Aires, apoyamos, sostenemos y estamos muy, muy orgullosos de ser socios, amigos, que nos encontramos en estos espacios donde seguir pensando en estas líneas de trabajo, seguir pensando y sumarnos a la memoria de todas las víctimas del Holocausto y sus familiares, y tener una responsabilidad muy concreta en cómo estas cuestiones tienen que seguir siendo parte de nuestra agenda para identificar todo lo que nos sirva para que todo esto no vuelva a pasar, para que esto sea un nunca más de verdad, y desde ese lugar estamos muy contentos de asociarnos con ustedes, de ser parte de esta actividad, de todo lo que va a venir, y por supuesto muy contentos de saber que hay una gran audiencia que se sumó a esta actividad. Así que, sin más, dejo el espacio a Jonathan o a quien sea que nos lleve a el momento más sustantivo de esta actividad, con la seguridad de que estamos acá apoyando hoy, pero en adelante también, para seguir siendo más fuertes en todas estas líneas. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Eugenia, y en tu nombre a todo el Auschwitz Institute por ser parte de este evento y de este ciclo. Ahora sí, continuamos con la magíster Marcia Raz para la presentación del doctor Gerlach, agradeciendo nuevamente a todos quienes nos acompañan detrás de la pantalla, y nuevamente, doctor Gerlach, un honor tenerlo hoy aquí. Hasta luego.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Johnny, muchas gracias, Eugenia. Por supuesto, muchísimas gracias, profesor Gerlach. Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches, buenos días a todos los que se han unido a escuchar la disertación que va a dar el profesor Gerlach. ¿Quién es Christian Gerlach? Actualmente es profesor de Historia Contemporánea en la Universidad de Berna, en Suiza. Antes de eso fue profesor en Freiburg, en Alemania, en el College Park de Maryland, en Singapur y en Pittsburgh. Sus áreas de especialización incluyen historia de la Alemania nazi, la violencia del siglo XX en la historia global, y alimentos, agricultura y políticas de desarrollo. Algunas de sus publicaciones son Calculated Murder, The German Economic and Extermination Policy in Belarus, que está solamente disponible en alemán. En español se destaca su publicación Sociedades extremadamente violentas, y queremos también destacar su The Extermination of the European Jews, que fue publicado en 2016 y que por el momento está solo disponible en inglés. En este momento el profesor Gerlach se encuentra trabajando en su próximo libro sobre los problemas del hambre y el desarrollo internacional. Profesor Gerlach, lo invitamos muy especialmente a que nos diga lo que tiene preparado para nosotros en esta tarde. Todo suyo.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Many thanks for the introduction and the invitation, also for coming, listening in. I have to apologize, first of all, for not addressing you in Spanish. This is because of my ignorance. Let me begin with some stories. In 1959, West German police found out that a man named Georg Heuser had been head of the German Gestapo in the occupied city of Minsk, Belarus in World War II, co-responsible for the killing of 100,000 people. However, it was difficult to arrest him because Heuser was head of the criminal police in the state of Rhineland-Palatinate and would have had to approve his own arrest warrant. So police waited for him to leave his state and took him in during holidays at a spa town in the state of Hesse. Later, he received a prison sentence of 15 years, of which he served 10. Axel de Vries, by contrast, was never on trial, born in Russia, later living as a journalist and politician in Estonia. He served during the German occupation of Belarus as a low-level economic officer, commissioned to exploit local agriculture for German interests. Aside from various repression against Belarusian peasants and co-organizing fighting partisans, he also suggested to his superiors in the winter of 1941 to kill, with help of Belarusian police, all Jews that remained in the villages, because they were the core of anti-German resistance, as he wrote. Doubtful as this statement was, also accusing communists and teachers, all of them, his proposal led to an official killing instruction against rural Jews. After the war, de Vries became a member of West German Parliament for the liberal Free Democrats in 1949 to 53. Less successful was Georg Frenzel in East Germany. In the late 1960s, police there found out that he had served with the German SS and police in occupied Belarus during the war. In a low rank, he had participated in massacres of Jews, destroying rural villages with their population during anti-guerrilla warfare, and he had driven a gas van, a truck in the back of which people were gassed to death. Questioned by the police, Frenzel stated that then he had felt that Jews were, I quote, inferior stuff. Before his arrest, however, Frenzel had joined the Communist Party of Socialist Unity, and even earlier, the Society for German-Soviet Friendship. He had a good reputation on his menial jobs and in his neighborhood. In 1970, Frenzel became one of the last people executed before the GDR abolished the death penalty. Last example, Dr. Heinz Rudolph was 29 years old when in 1942, he became head of the Department of Economy at the German-run General Commissariat of White Ruthenia in Western Belarus. Rudolph reorganized the regional economy in the German interest, trying to substitute Belarusians of Jewish and of Polish descent by ethnic Belarusians in the factories and workshops, and making Jews expendable so that they could be killed. After the war, he became a Christian Democratic Minister of Social Affairs in the state of Lower Saxony, West Germany, and held senior positions in big industrial corporations. In the 1960s, Rudolph held high positions at the OECD, that is the Economic Organization of Capitalist Industrial Nations, and at Euratom, the Atomic Energy Organization of the EEC. After which he was a high-ranking official in Malaysia's Industrial Development Authority at Kuala Lumpur, 1967 to 70. This was at the time when Malaysia worked out the new economic policy, favoring ethnic Malayans over Chinese and Indians in public service and public enterprises. No murders involved, but it resembled what Rudolph had done in Belarus in 1942. He also served as the founding chair of the Advisory Council of the Institute for Development Studies and Development Policy at the Ruhr University of Bochum in the early 1970s, and was teaching art history at Leuven University in Belgium. When in 1999, the German magazine Der Spiegel quoted from my book, his private letter of 1943, from anti-guerrilla warfare, saying that it did no harm for economic administrators to once exchange their pen with a machine gun, Rudolph demanded a rectification. Der Spiegel offered to publish his statement, lawfully, of course, together with a photocopy of his letter from 1943 provided by me. Under these conditions, Rudolph withdrew his demand, but wrote in a letter to me that I should interview him to find out what had really happened in occupied Belarus. I never spoke to him. These four men were of very different backgrounds: police officers, agricultural expert, propagandist, and economic functionary, in low and middle ranks, of low education and high, successful in their jobs after the war or not. Of course, these examples show continuities between Nazi Germany and post-war Germany. They also suggest that various German institutions took part in the murder of Jews in Belarus, that they cooperated therein with locals, and probably for a variety of motives, linked to many policy fields, and that the persecution of Jews was connected with mass violence against other social groups. Two men, Rudolf and Heuser, worked in areas under German civil administration, the others, de Vries and Frenzel, under German military administration. Two killed with their own hands. Two probably didn't. As their post-war fate suggests, these men were not from out of this world and socially well integrated then, afterwards, and before. The murder of Jews in Belarus then was a complex process with many people of all walks of life participating in some kind of division of labor. My presentation here is about the murder of Jews in Belarus, which was part of the Soviet Union in the 1940s and occupied by German troops 1941 to 44. Belarus is located between Russia and Poland and 1/12 of the size of Argentina. It was a flat or hilly place with many forests and meadows and swamps, a harsh climate, and no important mineral resources. In 1940, it had about 10 million inhabitants, was sparsely populated and still poor. Some industry had been erected there in the 1930s, but not much, and most of the people lived in rural areas. The country had suffered badly during World War I and the Russian Civil War. It went without famine in the 1930s, unlike neighboring Ukraine, but it experienced the great Soviet terror in the 1930s. The western half of Belarus had only become Soviet and Belarusian after the annexation of eastern Poland in 1939, with conflicts, disruption, violence, and near revolution that this entailed, including the Soviet deportation of some tens of thousands of Jews eastward. About 700,000 Jews lived in Soviet Belarus in mid-1941, mostly in urban places, towns, and a few cities. Equally in West and East, but those in the East were more assimilated and secular, less traditional and less segregated residentially and economically. In the country, there were also Polish and Russian minorities. To give you some dimensions, almost 1 in 4 Belarusians died in the German-Soviet War. Most of these, 1.6 to 1.7 million, were not killed in military combat. The biggest victim group were not Jews, but Soviet prisoners of war, of which 700,000 to 800,000 perished under the Germans by hunger, freezing to death, shooting, and in other ways. Of all non-combatant victims, close to 1/3 or 500,000 were Jews. Another 340,000 people or so were killed in anti-guerrilla warfare in the countryside. Other groups, of which many perished, were communists and urban resistors, forced laborers, people forced to retreat or fleeing westward with the Germans late in the war, Roma, and disabled people. Some overlaps between these groups existed. For example, some tens of thousands of prisoners of war or targeted in anti-partisan warfare were Jewish. For the Germans, there was not much to gain in Belarus. They attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941 for a mix of strategic, economic, and ideological reasons. The German leadership wanted to make their country the lords of Europe in the long term, which required the end of the Soviet state. In the short run, occupying the USSR was to make Germany unassailable by the Western powers, because the Soviet lands would give her strategic resources to replace overseas imports, in part actually from Argentina, edible oils, grain, mineral oil, and some ores. So the German population would not rebel. For Germany to appropriate these resources required to destroy much of the Soviet industry, that is, deindustrialize the country, and reduce the Soviet population, especially in cities and certain deficit areas. In the short run, food surpluses from the Soviet lands would feed the German military at the Eastern Front, which would also allow for real troop supplies by train to concentrate on men and arms. This way, killing tens of millions of Soviets by hunger was vital for the success at the front in this merciless war. To destroy the Soviet Union was also meant as a deadly blow to world communism, regarded as a Jewish-inspired ideology. And in the longer run, certain areas like Ukraine and the Baltic lands would be settled with Germans. But Belarus was no attractive settlement area, had no mineral resources, and was no food surplus area. Belarus was primarily important strategically as a base for attacking Moscow and as an area to supply the enormous armies needed for this. To squeeze surpluses out of a food deficit area necessitated in German minds the death of many people in Belarus, especially urban population. The farming population was more important alive to produce for the Germans. Concentrating troops at the front implied few occupation troops in the rear, and thus ruthless preventative terror against those likely to start uprisings and attacks on German supply lines. All of this was planned before attacking the Soviet Union. And this is where the Jews came in. About 30% of Belarus' urban population, to be decimated as useless eaters, was Jewish. And Jews seemed even harmful because Germans, drawing from prejudices, suspected them to be supporters of the Soviet regime and functionaries of its state, dangerous intellectuals, spies, bearers of resistance, false values, and enemy propaganda, and black marketeers that would divert resources from German requisitions. Therefore, their larger anti-Soviet plans, which were not only about Jews, turned against Belarusian Jews in particular intensity. Accordingly, in addition to harassment, plunder, and humiliation, days after the German invasion, SS and police units started to murder certain groups of Jews, male, adult, members of what was perceived as Jewish intelligentsia, communists, functionaries, teachers, and members of the professions. In Minsk and other Soviet cities, the military set up huge screening camps for all adult men, of which SS and police shot many, mostly, but not only Jews, but even more men were later released, including Jews. These selective murders went on for many weeks before SS and police units expanded their target range in 2 steps. From August 1941, Jewish women were also killed. And a few weeks afterwards, the annihilation of entire Jewish communities was started. Where this happened during 1941 is indicative of motives. It was largely in the eastern half of Belarus, in areas under German military occupation. The military administration and leadership had few hardcore Nazis in their ranks, different from the German civil administration in the West. But the East was where food was scarcer, where a larger part of cities were destroyed and housing was lacking, where train supplies were in a crisis, and where the first small partisan units were roaming. It was part of the military, which cultivated the myth, which SS and police also propagated, that Jews were responsible for pro-Soviet resistance. All Jews, and needed to be eradicated. In addition, it appeared to many Germans that Jews from Eastern Belarus were more dangerous because they had lived under the Soviet regime for decades, not just for 2 years, like in the West. Consequently, almost 200,000 Belarusian Jews, or 40% of those under German control, were murdered in 1941. While this included about a quarter of the Jews under German civilian rule, almost all Jews in the East were shot under German military rule, which was purportedly less politicized. So died the Jews of Vitebsk, Mogilev, Bobroisk, and Gom. In the fall of 1941, German functionaries dropped the idea to starve to death large parts of the civilian population. But at the same time, the mass murders of Jews and other demarcated groups were intensified. More prisoners of war were starved and frozen to death in their camps or shot. And to combat the guerrilla, the Germans started a hunt of suspects, and particularly of so-called non-locals, people found out of their place of residence, so refugees and so on. Soviet prisoners of war, not Jews, were the biggest victim group in 1941 in German-occupied Europe, as well as in Belarus. Unlike prisoners of war, Jews were not primarily killed by starvation. Jews received even less food than other Belarusians. They suffered from hunger, but in most places they didn't die of it. One exception was the ghetto of Vitebsk, with horrible scenes of emaciated corpses. Also, most Belarusian Jews were not gassed to death, except for those from the northwest who were later deported to Treblinka. About 10 gas vans were used for killings in Belarus, mainly against prison inmates and Jews deported from Central Europe, not Belarusian Jews. Most Jews from Belarus proper were shot. Some also beaten or tortured to death, smashed, drowned, or burned. The murderers wanted as little work and exposure as possible, so the main technique of mass shootings they developed was that a large pit was dug outside a town, city, or camp. Jews were marched there under brutal beatings, then often forced to undress, lined up at the edge of the pit, and shot with automatic weapons. I'm sorry to describe this to you, but the implications were important. Many people who fell into these pits were not dead, not mortally wounded, so that many died later under the other corpses, buried alive. And often there were some survivors crawling out, searching for help. This, and also the noise, the shooting, the screaming, the crying, led to the massacres becoming widely known among Germans, Jews, and the rest of the population. A second wave of mass murders occurred in 1942, mainly from May to October. That year was the peak of mass shootings of Jews in Belarus, with circa 250,000 killed. Often the killings were selective, but the criteria had changed. Unlike in the summer of 1941, when adult men were targeted, now it was primarily women and children. And those left alive for the time being were artisans, doctors, skilled workers, those whose values for exploitation had more weight than anti-Jewish sentiments and considerations about food, housing, and preventing disease and resistance. There were large killing campaigns engulfing all districts, first in Western and Central, then in Southwestern, and then Northwestern Belarus. Thus perished the Jews in Minsk largely, and Baranovichi, in Brest and Pinsk, and in Grodno. The 50,000 Jews living legally into 1943 died in that year or were deported westward to SS camps, from where few returned. It was also in 1943 when SS and police units started to burn the corpses, mostly of Jews. Once the Soviet advance started, the Germans tried to conceal their mass killings. They sent small teams around Eastern Europe who employed forced workers, often Jewish, to dig out old mass graves, burn the corpses on huge piles, smash any remains in the ashes, and then kill the forced workers. The outcome of this gruesome undertaking, which, for example, everybody could smell in Minsk for days, was telling. These teams unearthed large pits in a number of places across Belarus, but most mass graves they didn't find, which were discovered later by Soviet investigation teams after liberation with the intact human remains. This highlights how decentralized the mass murders had been, how many different German units had shot Jews and others, including security police and security service, order police, Waffen-SS, the military wing of the SS, German military units, and local Belarusian auxiliary police. That nobody was in central command, and that there was no central registry of killings and killing sites. It was brutal patchwork, terribly efficient, driven by multiple initiatives. And many different authorities had been involved: public offices, military units, and private companies exploiting Jews as workers, labor offices organizing their deployment, military and civilian administrations establishing ghettos, food administrations granting too small food rations or pressing for murder, military intelligence urging the murder of Jews, financial authorities robbing their possessions, railway officials organizing deportations. Most of this had not been the work of the SS and police. And even decisions about bigger and smaller mass murders were strongly influenced by military, civilian, and economic administrators, who all had their own reasons. Add to that local Belarusian administrators under German supervision, perhaps 100,000, and an equal number of local non-German police, who also had their own interests and ways in persecuting Jews. There were extermination camps in Belarus, but they were of minor overall importance. I mentioned two. In Malitrostinets, established in 1942, a bit outside Minsk, run by the German security police and security service, 40 to 60,000 people died. The majority of them were Jewish, and almost half of the total Jews from Germany, Austria, and Czechia, previously deported to Minsk in 1941 and 42. Many were murdered in gas vans, others shot, some tortured to death individually or burned to death. Malitrostinets also had non-Jewish victims, villagers deported during anti-guerrilla warfare, others from forced labor camps, and people arrested in Minsk for various reasons. Most people buried near Malitrostinets never became camp inmates. Less prominence has Bronaya Gora, a killing site near a small train stop in the south of Belarus in Polezia that existed for a few months in the second half of 1942. 30 to 40,000 people died here, probably all Jewish. During the destruction of the ghettos in southern Belarus, Jews from various towns, especially Brest, were brought there by train and shot. The story of these camps shows again that the killing process was not centralized. Now, how did Jews of Belarus survive? Let's first look at the numbers. I estimate that a bit less than 700,000 Jews were living in Belarus at the time of the German invasion. Of these, 150 to 180,000 survived, almost all of them by being evacuated or fleeing eastward to the Soviet hinterland in the summer of 1941. Only a few thousand survived on Belarusian soil, mostly with the communist partisans. Up to 10,000 Jews, usually from Minsk, were smuggled through gaps in the front line to the Soviet side, again with help of the partisans. Hundreds, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 Belarusian Jews survived as forced workers in German concentration camps, some in German prisoner of war camps, and very few living under false name in the occupied territory. This is not including the many tens of thousands of Jews who had been deported by the Soviet authorities for political reasons in 1940 and early 1941 eastward to internment camps, most of whom also survived. In terms of survival rates, 25% of Belarusian Jews lived to the end of the war, but of those getting under German occupation, probably less than 5%. And the survival rate of Central European Jews deported to Belarus was only 0.1%. Jews tried to understand German policies, were looking for the best possibilities for survival, and tried many of them, often consecutively. Flight to the Soviet hinterland turned out as the best option by far. But in the summer of 1941, the rapid advance of the German troops limited the chances of refugees, especially in Western Belarus. Also, opinions among Jews differed as to how dangerous the Germans were. In June 1941, mass executions of Jews had not yet started and could not possibly be known. Moreover, Soviet border guards in some cases prevented Jews from Western Belarus to cross the line eastward that had been the Soviet-Polish border until 1939. Most Jews and Belarusians could flee as part of the immediately organized Soviet evacuation effort, in which finally altogether 10 to 17 million Soviet citizens were brought eastward. Among them, at least 1.6 million Soviet Jews. A total of about 1.5 million people were evacuated from Belarus. Among Belarusian Jews, those from the east had greater chances than those from the west. Those from cities, greater chances than from remote towns or villages. Those working in factories and administrations with their families, greater chances than those in small enterprises or self-employed. For those who stayed on, joining the partisans turned out to be the best option remaining. However, life with the guerrilla was harsh and deterring, in hunger and cold, and in combat with the Germans or local police. Also, the partisans wanted persons in fighting age who from 1943 brought a weapon with them. They accepted few civilian refugees, children and elderly under their protection. Moreover, anti-Jewish attitudes made even pro-Soviet partisans often reject or kill Jews because they were regarded as potential German spies, as having previously cooperated with Germans in the ghettos, as a burden to the fighters, or because it was assumed that the Germans would attack partisan units more if Jews were with them. And indeed, the German forces attacked and pursued Jews among the partisans more ferociously than others. Anti-Jewish attitudes and action of Polish nationalist partisans, which operated in Western Belarus, were even stronger. On the other hand, many pro-Soviet guerrilla units did accept Jews, some also Jewish refugees unable to fight, and the two famous Jewish partisan units under Bielski and Zorin, with their combined 2,000 people, including civilians, operated under pro-Soviet partisans' protection. Also, Jewish and communist non-Jewish underground groups cooperated in smuggling thousands of Jews across the front, mainly from Minsk. However, if flight, mobility and migration were the best options, why did the majority of Belarusian Jews stay put so that the Germans could murder them? The main answer is that they had no place to go. It is true that on Belarusian territory there had been few pogroms by locals in the summer of 1941, unlike in neighboring Ukraine or Lithuania. But Belarusian society was too hostile for Jews just to flee and live somewhere. Many were without hatred of Jews, but too eager were the local police, often anti-communist and nationalist, to arrest Jews. Too many people in Belarus would denounce or threaten Jews. Too few would open their door or give help. out of anti-Jewish sentiments or intimidated by German threats of punishment. Also, one needed money to pay for expenses or bribes. Many Jews, sensing this, did not even try to hide. And if Jews fled the ghettos, only a small part of them survived among the non-Jewish population or in the forest for more than a few months. Characteristically, tragically, what Jews therefore often did when murder started in their place was fleeing from one ghetto to another, hoping that there the Germans would not be so harsh. In ghettos or camps, all they could possibly count on was to make themselves indispensable through work, which only bought them some time. Many would also not leave their family, their parents, their wife or husband, their children, and stayed. Some pious Jews refused to give up their lifestyle, easily recognizable they had no chance to hide. Survival then was for Jews a desperate effort to reintegrate within society, which was often unsuccessful. The problem was not just Germans, of course Germans, but also what local people did, though under German influence and control. People could rely more on the socialist Soviet state than on the people of Belarus. The German, Austrian, and Czech Jews deported to Belarus had the least chance to integrate. They were even isolated from the local Jews, even in the Minsk ghetto. This led to a survival rate of 0.1%, most of them Central European Jews in SS camps. What I wanted to say with this talk more generally is that Jews in Belarus did not just fall victim to some rogue regime or anonymous state apparatus or to some radicals, but that their persecution had many roots in German society and in part also Belarusian society, which makes explanations complex and which made escape so difficult. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a usted, profesor.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Nos ha dado una clase magistral sobre un aspecto que tal vez, al menos para algunos de las personas que habitualmente escuchan nuestras presentaciones, que es esto, lo que los historiadores llamamos el holocausto por medio de las balas. Tal vez estamos más acostumbrados a escuchar hablar de gaseamientos o de otro tipo de matanzas, pero usted nos ha recordado cómo lamentablemente hubo muchas formas de matar, muchos tipos diferentes de perpetradores y muchas víctimas también perseguidas por motivos diferentes, aunque en gran parte encontraron ellos el mismo final. Antes de pasar a las preguntas del público, yo quería hacerle una pregunta que fue algo que surgió entre los que estábamos organizando el ciclo de conferencias, que tiene que ver con el título que usted propuso para esta presentación. Si mal no recuerdo, fue algo así como la destrucción alemana de los judíos en Belarus, Bielorrusia, la destrucción alemana. Y alguien pensó, no, tendría que ser la destrucción nazi. Otro, no, la destrucción, bueno. Básicamente le pregunto, creo que sé cuál es la respuesta, pero ¿por qué eligió usted el adjetivo destrucción alemana, cuando incluso en parte de su presentación ha mencionado perpetradores que no son alemanes? Sin embargo, para describir todo el proceso habla de una destrucción alemana.
I hope I can be heard. Thank you for the question. Why German in the title? Well, it is important to emphasize the overriding significance of German organization and responsibility. So this is why I said German. A secondary reason is that there are sometimes misunderstandings, like in the Polish death camps. That is a phrase sometimes read or heard and is open to the misunderstanding that death camps were run by Poles, which is not the case. And therefore also I chose this title and inserted this German, and I add that it doesn't even sound elegant in English. But
Pero quizás también puedo agregar
something that you said. So of the about 6 million Jews that were murdered in Europe during the destruction, basically 1941 to 45, about 3 million were killed by gas. About 2 million were shot. And then there's another million who were killed by various other means, including about 500,000 by starvation. So it was not only in Belarus that shooting was very prominent, and by the way, also in German-occupied Poland.
Muchas gracias. Con su claridad y síntesis y pocas palabras, creo que es muy importante que un investigador alemán hable ante esta audiencia de la responsabilidad alemana en la destrucción de los judíos, bueno, en este caso de Bielorrusia, pero digamos, en Europa, básicamente, o en toda la Europa controlada por los alemanes o sus aliados o colaboradores. De todas formas, y acá me gustaría, aunque usted ha adelantado que los pogromos no fueron tan frecuentes en Bielorrusia con respecto a Lituania o Ucrania, pero también ha mencionado usted la participación de colaboradores locales en estas matanzas. Y me gustaría saber cómo entiende las motivaciones o el contexto que lleva a esta violencia creciente en estas regiones.
Okay, thank you. For certain reasons, I don't call them collaborators. Mm-hmm. The term collaboration in Europe connotes treason of one's own nation and the service of the Nazis. And you may have noticed that I usually speak of Germans, not Nazis. Mm-hmm. To make that clear, among the Germans, many of the organizers and perpetrators of the murder of Jews were not members of the Nazi party and therefore not Nazis. Mm-hmm. It's a big explanatory problem that there were many non-Nazis among those responsible on the German side. But your question was about the non-German side. And here in Belarus, we are dealing with mainly Belarusians, sometimes ethnic Poles, sometimes ethnic Russians, a few ethnic Tatars, and by the way, also, for example, Hungarian occupation troops among the killers of Jews. Now, what is about the Soviet citizens under German occupation in Belarus? Why did they participate? Many of these people did not cooperate with the Germans, that is the term that I use, because they loved Germans so much. Or not necessarily because they loved Nazis. They were rabid nationalists often, They were often anti-communist. Some of them were disgruntled or embittered by the fact that some of their relatives had been persecuted under Soviet rules and the rule in the 1930s. Also, they were often envious of Jews and their social and political position in the Soviet state or in the old Polish state as concerns what became Western Belarus. And they wanted to get such positions for themselves, positions in the administration, positions in the professions, like as doctors, as lawyers, or there were a few universities, but for example, as teachers. So there was something to be gained. Short-term gain, like pillage and plunder, was another reason that was certainly very important in the participation, especially of civilians, like people who were not policemen, auxiliary policemen under the Germans or administrators under the Germans, but civilians who denunciated Jews because, for example, Jews had given them their money and trusted their money with them to keep it. Now, many of these people had a motive to get these Jews precisely killed so that they could keep the money. So it was a broad range of motives, including also this idea of Jewish communism, that if one had suffered under the Soviet regime in the 1920s or 30s, then this was fault of the Jews, which was usually not the case, like factually, but believed by some anyway. And in the northwestern parts of Belarus, there was also religious anti-Jewish sentiments. The Jews as killers of Christ, who deserved to be killed. A wide range of motives, but again, usually not love of Germans.
Sí, esclarecedora su respuesta. En algún momento me parece que usted aventuró una especie de ratio, de proporción, ratio, entre perpetradores y víctimas. ¿Se anima a hacer alguna reflexión al respecto, aunque sea solo para el caso de Bielorrusia, porque es una cuestión central, ¿no? Digamos, ¿cuántos perpetradores se necesitan para ejecutar una matanza de esta escala?
At this scale?
Many things. I cannot give a number because I think it is not enough to look for so-called direct perpetrators, people who shot or were beating or burned a building where people were inside or drove a gas man. This was a complex undertaking in which many people, again, in a division of labor participated, and where it is not easy to delineate who was participating. This was also like who was responsible. This was also why many organizers, especially out of these military and civilian administrations, were not prosecuted after the war and lived peacefully to their end without ever having seen a prison cell from the inside. And therefore you cannot really tell how many. I can say that the average number of Germans, mainly military personnel, in 1942 to mid-1943 in Belarus was a few hundreds of thousands. But not all of them were involved in the murder of Jews. The Belarusian police, in the widest sense, about 100,000. The Belarusian administrators, about 100,000. German administration, military and civilian, all together. It depends on how you count, maybe 20,000, 10 to 20,000. Yes, but it's not easy to say who of them actually participated.
Imagino, pero permite darse una idea de los números que estamos hablando. Usted comenzó su exposición hablando de 4 casos de, bueno, sí, en este caso personas que cometieron crímenes en Bielorrusia, y el distinto final desde el punto de vista jurídico, legal que tuvieron. En el caso concreto de Argentina, nosotros sabemos que por lo menos un criminal importante, que es Radislav Ostrovsky, vivió por lo menos 2 años en Argentina. Algunas fuentes ubican a Heinrich Eiche, esto es controvertido en la bibliografía, como habiendo también pasado por Argentina. Bueno, para el público, Radislav Ostrovsky fue el jefe de gobierno títere de Bielorrusia durante la ocupación alemana, y Heinrich Eiche, el administrador de Malí-Trostenetz, salvo que el profesor quiera refinar todavía mi presentación de los personajes. Bueno, no solo en Argentina, sino sabemos que hay, ni en Alemania, que hubo criminales de guerra de Bielorrusia se refugiaron y vivieron tranquilamente en Estados Unidos, en Gran Bretaña, en Francia. Bueno, no sé qué reflexión le merece al respecto.
Mass murder is the crime that goes unpunished, by and large. This is how you recognize mass murder. I know of no single case where a country was able to catch all the perpetrators of a mass murder, put them on trial, and give them a just sentence. That was so in Germany, that was so in Argentina. There were also certain other events in Argentina that might come to mind. You could talk of the 1970s, for example, or of the 1870s. Who was punished then? Anyway, and it's the same where you look. Cambodia, Rwanda, Timor, whatever you take. The Soviet Union. It's all the same. My take on this is that this shows or reflects that these mass murders were deeply rooted in society. And you cannot put on trial all society. Certain people were always, if at all somebody was on trial, singled out as especially brutal, responsible, excessive, being in a high position, whatever, and then usually presented as outliers on whom much of the guilt was projected. There is no case where mass murder of this real big scale has ever been punished fully.
Aprovecho para hacerle 2 preguntas que vienen de la audiencia. Primero, si puede decir algo sobre el rol de la Iglesia Ortodoxa durante las matanzas, y sobre la evolución de la comunidad judía bielorrusa luego de la guerra.
Okay. The role of the Orthodox Church, at least I, don't know terribly much about. It was not as prominent as, for example, in German-occupied Ukraine, where there were Catholic and also Orthodox clergy, Christian Orthodox clergy, who were on the one hand involved in anti-Jewish propaganda, more or less, or also in saving Jews, for example, in monasteries. There could be actually in Belarus and also in different ways in Ukraine, society was divided about what to do about the persecution of Jews. There were all sorts of behavior, from rescue to pity to indifference to participation. And this wide range is reflected in Ukraine, for example, or was reflected in a wide range behavior of the churches or inside the churches. But in Belarus, the church was relatively weak. In Western Belarus, there was a lot of Catholicism that was tied to Polish nationalism and not necessarily pro-Jewish. In fact, in the area of Białystok, there were Catholic priests inciting pogroms and inciting killing Jews. But in much of Belarus, not even this was the case. And you also, I don't have the cases of people being saved in monasteries like in Poland, in Ukraine, in Hungary, and so on. So I would argue that the churches did not play much of a role, except for perhaps in the northwest of Belarus. And there are certain communities like the Baptists in like a small Christian community in Polesia, which became famous for saving thousands of Jews, or at least trying to save thousands of Jews. That was kind of exceptional for a community that also only counted several thousand people. After liberation, Belarus was destroyed. In mid-1944, upon liberation in Belarus, there were about 7 million people. Yeah? About 1.5 million had fled to the east. 2 million, close to 2 million had died. 7 million were in the country, and of these 3 million were without shelter, because much of the country was destroyed. Many of the buildings were destroyed. It was not an easy life. It took a while before people came back from the army or from evacuation, like from Central Asia, from Russia, from Siberia, wherever, from the Caucasus. But many Jews who had lived in Belarus did return to Belarus. And unlike in Poland, they stayed usually for a long period. Some of them later moved to big cities in the Soviet Union, like Moscow, or Leningrad, or something. But many stayed until the 1990s, when there was a wave of emigration. Until then, a fairly large Jewish community still existed in Soviet Belarus. I hope that's
Sí, sí, absolutamente. Creo que quedan un par de preguntas nomás y lo vamos a liberar. Una tiene que ver, me ha desaparecido, con los campos. Usted menciona los campos de exterminio menciona o describe como campos de exterminio a Valí, Trostinets y a Bronaya Gora, del que no había escuchado hablar hasta su presentación. Es más, creo que en el caso de del descubrimiento de Malí Trostinets, posiblemente usted sea uno de los artífices más importantes en este caso. En descubrir, digamos, la existencia de este centro de exterminio. Ahora, mi pregunta es, ¿considera usted que estos dos campos tienen que incluirse dentro de, vamos a decir, la lista de los 6 campos de exterminio, entre comillas, tradicionales o más aceptados por la historiografía? Obviamente Birkenau, Belzec, Sobibor, Helm, ¿no? Majdanek, Treblinka. ¿Cree usted que deben ser agregados a esta lista o que pertenecen a otra, entre comillas, categoría que sería como de un sitio de matanza, un centro de matanza, pero no un campo de exterminio en el sentido que se suele entender a los otros lugares de exterminio que mencioné?
Thank you. First of all, the camp of Malý Trostinec was discovered by Soviet troops in the summer of 1944. There were extraordinary investigation committees in each county of the formerly German-occupied Soviet territories, including in each county of Belarus, and they all made their protocols. They all tried to find the mass graves in each county and reconstruct events. Hear witnesses, unearth pits, and so on. And the Soviet Extraordinary Commission for Belarus highlighted this camp very much. Also in the national dogma, the number of victims is given with more than 200,000, exactly 206,500. This is an exaggeration, I think, by far. As I said, 40 to 60,000 is more realistic. So it's not, I mean, it was discovered by the Soviets and propagated by the Soviets, and there are big commemorative sites, for example, in a place called Khatin, that's not Katyn, but Khatin in Belarus, the site of an exterminated village, where also there is there's commemoration of other places in Belarus, including this camp of Malý Trostinec. Then one has to know this was not the most deadly place in German-occupied Belarus. There were prisoner of war camps, Soviet prisoner of war camps, where more people died. 80,000, 100,000. Realistic figures according to what the investigation committee said about the size of the mass graves. And there were other sorts of camps, labor camps, labor collection camps, Organisation Todt camps, evacuation camps, and so on and so on. Should places like Malý Trostinec get on a list? I don't know how important that is. It is worth noting that there were other places of mass murder or concentrated mass murder by the Germans than the 5 usually cited death camps, or 6 with Majdanek. But where to draw a line, what to include and what not to include, there was no qualitative difference, I think, between Malý Trostinec and a place like Treblinka, except in size of the number of victims. Most of the people who came to Mali-Trostinets were killed. There were few survivors. Should it be on a list? I don't know. But then you would also include certain places under Romanian occupation, Jasenovac for the independent state of Croatia, and so on. I don't know how much this helps. But a certain commemoration also of a place like Bronnaya Gora would certainly be good. And again, that was also taken note of still already by Soviet extraordinary committees. Everything was known within a few months in Belarus.
Muchas gracias otra vez. Creo que quedan dos preguntas. Una es breve, que viene del público. Alguien pregunta si su trabajo, creo que conozco la respuesta, pero sería bueno que la dé usted, que si su trabajo y su investigación está relacionado de alguna forma con el trabajo del padre Patrick Debois, creo que lo debe conocer. Para los que escuchan o participan a veces de estas actividades que organiza el museo, el padre Debois visitó Buenos Aires también y dio una conferencia, entonces es por eso que es conocido en nuestros medios.
No, it's not really related. Patrick Debois sold these things as new discoveries that were perhaps new discoveries for a French audience. Mm-hmm. My contention is that there are nationalists. There's not one history of the Holocaust. There are many national histories of the Holocaust. The French history of it is very much centered on Auschwitz, because most French Jews who were deported to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is very prominent in Central and Western Europe because Western European and Central European Jews, including German Jews, were for a large part deported there. This is nationalism which I not necessarily aspire to. Therefore, it was a surprise Holocaust by bullets, which of course had been known for a long time in the Nuremberg trials. There had been an extra trial about the Einsatzgruppen, some of the murder units who had shot people in the Soviet Union. This was kind of lost knowledge recovered for a French audience. And I want to add something. If one, coming back to the previous question, if one looks at Mali-Trostinets, one privileges the commemoration of Central European Jews, of German, Austrian, and Czech Jews deported, because few Belarusian Jews were killed in or around Mali-Trostinets. Mostly they were killed in other places in and around Minsk. So it would again be putting a place into the limelight that has to do not with the murder of the local Jews. And whether this is for whom this is politically so opportune, I wonder.
Doctor, antes de pasar a la última pregunta, le quiero agradecer muy especialmente que esta reflexión que ha hecho sobre la centralidad en muchos casos de Auschwitz. Creo que lo que dijo de Francia tal vez se aplique también a la Argentina. y que nos lleve a reflexionar sobre la totalidad del acontecimiento del Holocausto. Como bien dijo, más de 2 millones de víctimas que ni siquiera fueron gaseadas, y como algunas de ellas, en el relato historiográfico, parece que tienen mayor estatus que otras de las víctimas, judías también, pero según su lugar de nacimiento. Pero bueno, voy a hacerle mi última pregunta y voy a ceder la palabra para el cierre de esta actividad. Pero esta conferencia, que tanto le agradecemos su participación, fue convocada pensando en los 80 años del año 1941, que no tengo que recordarle, es el año en el cual en algún momento se tomó la decisión del exterminio total de todos los judíos al alcance alemán. Entonces mi pregunta es, porque ya tuvimos a 2 expositores y cada uno de ellos marcó un momento clave diferente, con lo cual siéntase a gusto para dar una respuesta seguramente distinta de las 2 que recibimos sobre este mismo tema. ¿Cuál considera usted que es el momento, el periodo, el acontecimiento, la decisión que marca, digamos, o que es el punto de inflexión en que empieza a aplicarse esta política de exterminio total de los judíos europeos?
Of European Jews.
Okay, the main point would be there is no such point.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I think the whole results of the scholarship of the last 40 years is this was a long process that at least took 1.5 years in 1941 and 1942, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go further and argue, I also once wrote together with the colleague Götz Ali a book on the murder of the Jews in Hungary in 1944. I would argue that the decision process never ended before 1945. So I have published an article that's also available in Spanish that places an overall decision in principle by Hitler to murder all European Jews in December 1941. Who is interested in that can try to look that up or try to get information about it on the internet. However, that decision by Hitler was of almost no impact in Belarus. Also saying that one decision by Hitler did not have so much importance in the overall process as to immediately start the setup of death camps all around, to immediate deportations of everybody to some place or mass shootings or whatever. And the connection between this decision and Belarus, there are some of like a tertiary character, but the implications for Belarus were really minor. This again points to one of my main arguments, that this was a complex process. There were many actors in this process, in different institutions, on different levels. And Hitler did play a role, but that wasn't enough.
Nos deja mucho para pensar. Le agradezco enormemente algunas de las cuestiones. Bueno, el auditorio, cada uno encontrará algo de lo que usted ha dicho particularmente fructífero para la reflexión. El rol de los, en vez de colaboradores, los que cooperaban con el Tercer Reich, el aspecto descentralizado de las matanzas, el impacto que puede tener una decisión de Hitler en lugares, entre comillas, remotos o más alejados de Berlín, las motivaciones de los perpetradores. Bueno, ha realmente tocado una variedad de tópicos extremadamente ricos, y se lo agradezco enormemente.